Uh, Professor Chomsky, welcome to IMSciences. My name is Mohsin Khan, and I am the head of this institution. IMSciences is a mid-sized business school of Pakistan. We are based in KPK, which is the province very close to Afghanistan. Where we are located, we are about half an hour of driving time from the border with Afghanistan. We would like to welcome you and thank you also for giving you time for this session. Today I have with me here my students, faculty members, some of our board members, and some of vice chancellors, previous chancellors. So they're all very eager to listen to you. The topic we thought we would discuss with you and hear your viewpoint is how would the Americans extricate themselves from this imbroglio in Afghanistan. When we were trying to arrange this session, at that time it was the American view was that they will leave Afghanistan and leave just a handful of soldiers for their embassy protection. But in last couple of weeks, as you know, President Obama's administration has changed their decision, and they are thinking of keeping 9,000 to 10,000 of their forces here. So it, in a sense, means that their policy has again failed. And you're an expert in this area, among other areas. Questions we had already forwarded to you, but those questions, I think, some of them have already changed the scenario. So we would like to hear from you, and then from my audience, there will be questions to you. But first, we would like to hear your opening remarks, please.
Well, there's no doubt that the policies have been a total failure. Some of the reasons are well known. They were reviewed in some detail and very persuasively in an important book by Anand Gopal a year or two ago. And what he discovered and reviewed is just continuing. The American forces and the NATO forces generally hardly know what they're doing. They're being used by one or another warlord to settle their own grievances and interests. It's led to the spread of lawless, destructive system, which is just expanding. The Taliban, of course, are exploiting it and appear to be stronger than ever until the basic sources of the conflicts are dealt with, which have to do with the rights of various groups, including crucially the Pashtun population, which has been marginalized. There's just going to be no settlement there. It cannot be settled by force and violence. The use of force for the last 14 years has spread jihadi terror from a tiny corner of Afghanistan, Pakistan, to large parts of the world, from West Africa to South Asia and Southeast Asia, and has led to the development of really monstrous forces like so-called Islamic State. And the more the region is struck by sledgehammers of violence without attention to the social, economic, and political problems, the needs and concerns in the tribal areas and elsewhere, I think it's just going to be more and more disaster. There's no sign of any significant improvement, small sectors here and there, but not much, totally incommensurate with the huge efforts that have been poured in, which have mostly had harmful effects. So there's I see no alternative to moves internal to Afghanistan and the tribal areas in Pakistan towards some kind of reconciliation and accommodation of local forces. Outsiders so far have been quite harmful, and that's been true for a long time, and they show no signs of having constructive policies that would help lead in a better direction.
Think tanks, do you think the think tanks that you have in the U.S. administration supporting it, aren't they able to guide the administration how to get out of this situation and how to improve the situation here? Because as you see, it has expanded to other areas, other countries as well.
Well, the answer to that is, unfortunately, in the historical record of the preceding years, and as we can all see before our eyes, whatever, if the think tanks have had some kind of impact, it has not translated into constructive policies that are improving the situation. On the contrary, the policies keep being repeated with the same negative consequences. I mean, there are people who've had proposals, like Akbar Ahmed, for example, but as far as I know, these are not being considered.
Okay. I have lived in Afghanistan for about 3.5 years, and when I left Afghanistan in 2008, there was some ray of hope, because somehow in that madness there were certain things which were falling in place. But I was there only last month, and I tell you that there was a complete lack of trust and lack of hope amongst the people. There is a large number of educated people who are fleeing the country. They are going to India, they are going to Europe, they are going to Iran. A large number of people are going to Iran because they believe that with the partial ease of sanctions on Iran, they could go into Iran and then from there Turkey and all that. So the situation as it looks today, people are of the view that either it is going to be the Taliban or it is going to be the ISIS who are going to take over, and everybody is on the run.
Unfortunately, that's correct. There have been in the past periods when there were rays of hope. That was actually true even during the Najibullah brief period before the West allowed the extremist groups of the Mujahideen to destroy whatever possibilities there were, paving the way for the Taliban. And since then, yes, occasionally there have been a few rays of hope, but they've been dimmed, which just tells us that the basic policies are seriously misguided, and that there has to be a shift in direction, which will, I think, simply have to come from accommodation that of local forces paying attention to their concerns and interests, without the imposition of a lawless, brutal reign of either violent warlords or Taliban, or the worst possible would be if ISIS sets up a kind of a base there. I don't actually expect that, but it could happen, which would be the absolute worst outcome. And I think those are the directions in which we're going, exactly as you described. There was a period also at the end of the last period of the Russian occupation when educated people did have some kind of options, but that soon ended.
Professor, My name is Lutfullah, and I have had the pleasure of being abducted by Taliban for a year, and I have spent a year with them. So I would just simply like, to ask a question which is not directly related to the topic. But when the Russians left Afghanistan, I think the whole world, including Pakistan, abandoned Afghanistan and the Mujahideen, which took over which actually led to the exit of the Russians. Now, was it planned actually that way? Because Afghanistan was just left in the lurch. And the Taliban actually are basically turned Mujahideen. So did anybody actually realize that at that time?
Sorry, I didn't understand the question. Could you repeat it? I understood that you were captured by the Taliban for a year?
Yes.
Yes, and what was, I didn't understand the question that followed.
Well, the question actually is that when the Russians left Afghanistan,
Yeah.
Afghanistan was abandoned by the world.
Abandoned, exactly.
Yeah.
When the Russians withdrew their aid to Najibullah,
Yes.
the United States did not withdraw its aid to the extremist elements of the Mujahideen, like Peshawar
Yes.
and others. And they, I don't have to tell you, they practically destroyed Kabul. They instituted a reign of terror that was so extreme that when the Taliban finally came, many people welcomed them as less awful than what was there. And then they established a regime of extreme repression and violence. It's possible that they could have been overthrown from within. That was certainly the opinion of many of the anti-Taliban activists within Afghanistan. We don't know, but finally came the war and the invasion, and that just set the whole process back even farther.
Well,
You're quite right. Abandoning Afghanistan at that time was, to the people who were going to destroy it, was a terrible mistake, if not crime.
well, there is something else also which is connected to this thing. Is it that the West actually is trying to impose democracy? Impose
Is who trying to?
democracy
Who
in the
trying?
world?
Is who trying to impose democracy?
The West.
The West.
No.
The West.
No, of course not. The West doesn't try to impose democracy in its own domains. Of course, everyone talks about democracy. Even Stalin talked about democracy. But if you want to know whether they're trying to impose democracy, you look at policies. So the West, meaning, say, take France in Africa, where they've supported the most vicious, brutal dictators and undermined popular forces in their region so that they can maintain control. British, exactly the same. In the post-Second World War era, the United States has been the most important country of the West by a large margin, and its record has been to undermine democracy repeatedly. In fact, this is well established in scholarly studies. Even the studies by the strongest advocates of what's called democracy promotion. So if you like, take a look at the literature. The main work, scholarly work, on what's called democracy promotion has been done by a scholar, political figure, Thomas Carruthers, who was head of the Carnegie Endowment for Peace section on law and democracy. And he's basically a Reaganite. He was in the Reagan State Department working on democracy promotion. And he's done extensive studies of U.S. democracy promotion policies primarily in Latin America, but elsewhere as well. And he draws a very clear conclusion, which is pretty obvious from anybody who's been watching it. He says these policies are what he calls schizophrenic, meaning there's talk about democracy, but action to undermine it. In Latin America, the area where the U.S. has by far the most influence, he pointed out that there had been moves to democracy in the southern cone, the southern part of the hemisphere, where the United States had least influence, and the U.S. has tried to impede them, but they went on anyway. As you move to regions closer to U.S. influence, Central America and the Caribbean, there have been many fewer steps towards democratization. They're under U.S. control. And he says the reason is that the United States has supported democracy, wants to maintain top-down forms of rule in the hands of elite elements who are susceptible to U.S. influence and control. Now, he's not a left-wing critic. He's coming from the Reaganite pro-democracy promotion efforts, but he's a serious scholar, and he observes what's happening. And the same is true in the Middle East and elsewhere. Now, take a look at democracy promotion in Iraq. When the U.S. invaded Iraq, there was virtually no talk about democracy promotion. A few words on the side, kind of routine words that leaders use all the time. The single question, as George Bush and Tony Blair kept repeating, was Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. That was the single question, right? Okay, turned out the single question had the wrong answer. Yeah. And when the wrong answer was discovered, all of a sudden, it turned out that the reason for the U.S.-British invasion was to promote democracy. Iraqis just laughed. There were polls at the time. About 1% of Iraqis believed that the U.S. was interested in upholding democracy. If you look what happened after, of course, it's true. Of course, in the West, the educated classes, the media, immediately jumped on the bandwagon and talked about how wonderful it was that we were promoting democracy, but nothing like that is true. Take a look at the Arab Spring. It began in Tunisia, French place of French influence. The French strongly supported the dictator, kept supporting him literally even after he'd been driven out of the country. And finally, they had to tolerate his expulsion. The next country to where the strong reform efforts took place was Egypt, largely under U.S.-British influence. U.S. and Britain supported the dictator, Musharraf, up to the last minute, literally the last minute. When he couldn't be supported any longer, he was sent off Sharm el-Sheikh, and since then the efforts have been to try to reconstitute a similar system. In the states that are of primary interest to the West, the oil dictatorships, there were small reform efforts, but they were crushed very quickly with U.S.-British support. In Saudi Arabia, people were afraid to go out into the streets in Riyadh because of the strength of the police presence. U.S. never lifted a finger. When Saudi Arabia sent forces into Bahrain to undermine the reform movement there, the West supported it. And this is the pattern throughout the world. Everyone talks about democracy, as I say. Even Stalin talked about democracy. But a serious person will pay no attention to the rhetoric of leaders, which is always very elevated, and simply observe their actions. And the reasons for opposition to democracy are pretty clear. Democratic developments will tend to empower popular forces who follow policies that Western elites do not approve of. Why should they support democracy? So, for example, at the time of the Arab Spring, spring of 2011, that in Egypt, a large part of the population thought that Iran ought to have nuclear weapons to counter the Israeli and U.S. power. Is that the kind of policy the U.S. wants to be upheld in Egypt? In fact, the real truth is that the elite elements do not want democracy in their own countries. In their own countries. Simply take a look, and for good reasons as well. So take a look at the United States, which is as democratic as any state in the West, if not more. In the United States, about mainstream political science shows that about 70% of the population, the lowest 70% on the income scale, are simply unrepresented. Their attitudes and opinions have no detectable effect on the policies of their own representatives. As you move up the scale, you get more and more influence. At the very top, a fraction of 1%, you basically have policies formulated. That's not 100% true. These are strong tendencies, not 100%. So the U.S. is very far from being a totalitarian state. It's a form of democracy, and there are democratic rights. But the outcome of social and economic forces is to produce what amounts to a plutocracy. And that's in the interests of the designers of the system. This struggle goes on throughout history. There have been achievements in expanding democracy, undoubtedly. Now, they're very significant, but they don't come from leaders and they don't come from elites. They come from popular movements which struggle to expand the range of freedom and democracy and meet plenty of resistance. In third world countries, you can hardly expect Western powers to be supporting democracy. They very rarely have.
Yeah, so coming back to Afghanistan, Professor Chomsky, there is a wide-held view that the way the present government is structured, with the president, which is a constitutional position, and with a chief executive with a non-constitutional title, the government is weak and it is in a total disarray. How do we expect a weak government and a very confused government to resolve this massive issue, political and security issue in Afghanistan, least to talk about the outsiders or the powers from outside? How can the Americans or the West expect the present arrangement to deliver? Because there is a very huge contradiction. Abdullah, he believes that if Ashraf Ghani strengthens, or that would amount to his political death. So nothing is really happening out there. The orders from the top never reach the lower echelons of the government, and people have losing faith in the ability of the present government to deliver at any stage.
Well, the answer, I think, is self-evident. There's no way for a government structured like that to deliver. The end result is where people live, what they see, what's around them, is lawlessness, corruption, from almost nothing to trust in the governmental structures. We saw that in Kunduz recently, but elsewhere as well. This kind of structure certainly cannot function. The only hope that I can see is things like there's a very interesting, mostly young peace movement in Afghanistan among young people. If it can extend and develop, I think it offers hope from the ground. Popular movements developing can, if they get outside support, offer some rays of hope for accommodation locally, for introducing more responsive, lawful authorities, and maybe ultimately it can affect the general governmental structure. But it's not going to come from Western initiative or from the top where people have their own interests. I should say Pakistan has had a very ugly role in all of this for a long time. That's a separate story.
But I don't want to get
We have we'll hear that.
Professor, many Afghan believes that the Taliban insurgency in Afghanistan is acting as Pakistan proxies. What is your opinion on the indigenous roots of the Taliban insurgency, and what would happen if Pakistan sever its relation with Taliban in Afghanistan?
Well, Pakistan is pursuing its Pakistani government and intelligence service mainly have been pursuing their own goals in Afghanistan, not in the interests of the people of Afghanistan. Pakistan is wedded to a policy which is self-destructive and is going to harm anyone in the region. The policy is trying to confront India militarily at a level of some sort of, to maintain some sort of military balance with India. That's impossible. The country cannot develop, cannot deal with its own problems until it makes serious moves towards reconciliation with India. This is two directions. India, too, has to move. But the primary concern for Pakistan, and I think for India, ought to be to reduce, limit, resolve the India-Pakistan conflict, to demilitarize it, to move towards a settlement in Kashmir, to begin to dismantle the extremely dangerous nuclear weapon systems, and to move as much as they can towards putting an end to the confrontation and hostility which is poisoning the whole region. As long as Pakistani policy is guided by this belief that the strategic doctrine that they have to maintain control of Afghanistan as a weapon against India, it's going to be a disaster. And it's a disaster for Pakistan. Now, Pakistan is a country who has plenty of internal problems. You know them better than I do. I don't have to run through them. They're enormous. And they just cannot be confronted when the government and state policy is directed towards a hopeless, self-destructive confrontation with India, which will never achieve anything except undermining and destroying Pakistan. So I think that's got to be item number one for Pakistanis. And if they can make some progress on that, and that of course requires Indian cooperation as well, same problem on the other side, then maybe Pakistan can withdraw from its extremely harmful activities in Afghanistan, including its complex support for Taliban and other groups.
Chomsky, my question is about the structure of power in Afghanistan. Since the invasion of Afghanistan back in 2001 by the Western forces, the emphasis has been more to support the northern allies, certain group of ethnicity. The Pashtun have been completely alienated, thus creating chaos in Afghanistan. What do you say about that?
That's exactly correct. It was obvious from the very beginning, that supporting the Northern Alliance was going to exacerbate already existing ethnic and tribal conflicts, and that the Pashtun population would be bitter, resentful, and supportive of efforts to overcome the regime which is harmful to them, which is just what's happened. Yes, that's quite true. Something similar happened in Iraq. The Iraqi society was very weak already. It had virtually been destroyed by the vicious sanctions of the 1990s, which were literally almost genocidal. The administrators of the sanctions, distinguished international diplomats, Dennis Halliday, Hans von Sponek, both of them resigned in protest because they regarded the sanctions as, in their words, genocidal. And they also pointed out, pretty plausibly, I think, that the sanctions were destroying the civilian society, strengthening the dictator, and possibly saving him from being overthrown from within, as has happened to a whole string of dictators. Anyway, the society was, it had been an advanced society, was quite weak, semi-shattered. Then came the invasion. The invasion was like a sledgehammer hitting a fragile system. That's going to cause all kinds of problems. But in addition, the U.S. invaders instituted a sectarian system, which hadn't existed before. They instituted sectarian divisions. That, along with the violence and brutality of the invasion, pretty soon inflamed a sectarian conflict, which hadn't existed before. Shiite and Sunni in Iraq were living together. Sometimes they didn't know who was who. You know, it was. But the sledgehammer did incite this conflict, and now it's tearing Iraq to shreds. It's tearing the whole region to shreds. And something similar happened exactly as you described in Afghanistan. There were confrontations and conflicts. They became worse as a result of the policies of the invaders. And in particular, the kind of policies that, as I mentioned, Anand Gopal in particular spelled out in such detail, the use of West American, mainly American troops, as weapons by one gangster against another gangster. And the troops had no idea what they were doing. You know, they were told, if this guy is supporting the Taliban, go kill him. It turned out he was somebody supporting the United States who was hated by some other gangster. That's happened over and over again. Of course, that's what happens when you move into a society that you understand, about which you understand absolutely nothing, and try to impose solutions by force. The chances that anything decent could come out of that are minuscule. And incidentally, that's why respected people like Abdul Haq, for example, bitterly condemned the invasion and before he was killed, and argued that it was undermining the efforts of anti-Taliban Afghans to overthrow the Taliban from within. There were similar things in Iraq. I think there's much merit in those views and in what you describe. What you describe is, unfortunately, all too accurate.
Professor, I'm assuming my question is going to be the last question, so I'm going to take this liberty to ask you about something that has been bothering me for some time, ever since I've read your book. Your voice has been a voice of dissent against the American imperialism, and that too for about 4 or 5 decades, if not more. I was just wondering, how have you managed this and so far without being obstructed by so many U.S. administrations? How is it that you can be so vocal against the policies and against the implementation of those policies in the United States?
How come? The answer, there's plenty of things wrong with the United States. I've written about them, you know about them. But it happens to be a very free society. Now, the capacity of the government to repress is very limited by comparative standards. Freedom of speech is protected beyond any country that I know of. There are all kinds of reasons for this, but the fact is plain. And in fact, it goes well beyond what you probably know. Like during the 1960s, Vietnam War, I was in and out of jail, came very close to a long jail sentence for supporting resistance activities. And it wasn't just me. It was a group of quite a few people, not a huge number, but a number. We were mostly employed in a laboratory at MIT, where I am, which was 100% supported by the three armed services. And we were quite openly and publicly involved in resistance against the war. We were not repressed. I mean, of course, by the government, yes, obviously. In fact, we were asking for it, but not by the institution. Well, that's what it's like to be in a free society. Again, plenty of things wrong with the United States, lots of things to criticize, but there are also some good things. And they haven't been given as a gift. They've been won by long, hard, popular struggle. These rights did not exist in the past. They were won by struggle. They got to be maintained all the time. They're always under attack, but nevertheless can be done. And it can be done elsewhere too. Conditions here in the past had been extremely harsh. I've seen it as a child and in later years. But it's gotten better because of the struggles of plenty of people to expand freedom and rights. And that's progress throughout history. That's how you got rid of slavery. That's how you get a degree of women's rights, civil rights, freedom of speech, democratic rights. It's a constant struggle. Workers' rights. It's a constant struggle. Goes back, regresses sometimes, but overall there's a kind of a trajectory towards progress. And I think that could be true in highly conflicted regions like yours as well, with enormous difficulty. I'm not underestimating it. Vastly harder than it is for me here.
Yeah, Professor Chomsky, I've been given a chance to ask another question. First of all, I'm really grateful that you gave us a chance in this part of the world to interact with you. My question partially builds on the previous question, especially that we come from a society which is not that free by relative standards. For me personally, yourself and people like Professor Norman Finkelstein, who had the chance to interact at previous opportunities, you two are people who have used academia or the academic discourse as a great outlet for the passion you have about political causes. That lacks a lot in this part of the world. My question is, how can we as academics and academic institutions encourage our students and the youth to take up this path and maybe have a stronger say on the academic platform and push the causes which we are passionate about through these means instead of others, many of which are not that good, some of which are good in ways. So how can we encourage our students, and how would you encourage students in parts of the world like ours? Thank you.
There are no magic keys. There are no special methods, or if there are, people have kept them secret. The only way to proceed is by what is second nature to activists. Educational efforts, reaching out to people, understanding their concerns, encouraging them to think for themselves, moves towards organization where it's possible, picking up whatever kinds of activism are appropriate to circumstances. It's a constant, continued struggle. I mean, take my friend Norman Finkelstein, who you mentioned, and has had an enormous impact in helping to change opinion in the United States on the primary issue that he's been concerned with, Israel-Palestine. He's been very much marginalized. He's done scholarly work. He's given lots of talks. He tries to reach out to any group he can. And over time, there's been an effect. I mean, I can just tell you from my own experience. Until about maybe 15 years ago, 20 years ago, when I gave talks on Israel-Palestine, I literally had to have police protection, even at my own university, right here where I'm sitting. Police insisted on being there. Police would insist on walking me back to my car because of threats. The issue was so tense and unpopular, even on university campuses, that you literally had to have police protection to talk about it. Meetings were broken up, near violence, often airport security at university meetings. The last 10 or 15 years, that's changed enormously. By now, there are enormous crowds, a lot of interests. Palestinian rights are one of the main topics on campus, and it's due to the constant, slow, dedicated efforts of people like Norman Finkelstein, a few others. I've been involved as well. And there's just no other way. It was the same on the Vietnam War. When I began giving talks about the Vietnam War in 1961, I was literally giving talks in the living rooms of friends or in a church with maybe 4 people there. Tremendous hostility. In Boston, which is quite a liberal city, the first demonstrations against the war, 1965, were violently broken up, violently disrupted and broken up. Bitter attacks in the newspapers and so on. Finally, after a lot of effort, a quite substantial anti-war movement developed, which had a significant impact. And it's the same on every other issue. That's the only way. Just have to keep struggling ahead, and sometimes you can make progress. But the methods are, we all know, the methods are education, organization, whatever activism is appropriate to circumstances. There's no general answers. Whatever, plenty of historical examples, but plenty of our own experience, and those are the only methods available. And they work over time, they can work.
Professor, I would like to take a comment from you on the American extension of troops on the ground in Afghanistan till 2017. I would like to know if was it a long time planned I can say policy of the US, or is it because of the direct involvement of the Russians in Syria in the fight against ISIS and the other jihadis? Or I would like to know that was it part of a long thought process of the US policy, or has it taken place because of the Russian involvement in the Middle East, and maybe the Americans are thinking that they are going to put troops back sometime near in Afghanistan? So I would just like to know how can you comment on this, sir, please?
Frankly, I don't think the American government has any idea what it's doing. Its policies are completely incoherent, and there's no long-term policies. They're just trying to put out small fires wherever they show up. In Afghanistan, I don't think it had anything to do with the Russians. It's that the situation is just totally out of control. They thought, they had hoped that the Afghan army that they'd worked on would somehow be able to impose order. Obviously can't. The same is true in Iraq. I mean, Iraq, what happened in Mosul and Ramadi was just astonishing. There's an Iraqi army of 350,000 men heavily armed, trained by the United States for years. And Iraq had in the past a very efficient army. You know, not a nice country, a lot of things wrong with it, but the army was an efficient institution. Let's take a look at the Iraq-Iran war. So here's 10 years of training by the United States, heavy arms, 350,000 men. As soon as a couple of jihadis showed up in trucks, they ran away, leaving their weapons behind. The generals ran first, and the troops ran after them. That was the result of years and years and billions of dollars of expenditures. Pretty much the same has happened in Afghanistan. You cannot construct something efficient and functioning out of a rotten structure. That it has to come from below, from people's actual participation. I think in Afghanistan the U.S. is just flailing, has no policies. Syria is a more intricate case, and bear in mind that the Russian troops, the Russian intervention was to a certain extent instigated by a U.S. shipment of advanced armaments. Actually, there was actually an article in the Washington Post, the national press, just a couple of weeks ago, where the headline was something like, did the United States draw Russia into Syria? And what it described is how the CIA sending advanced tow missiles, anti-tank wire-guided tow missiles, to jihadi groups that the United States supports had such a harsh effect on the Syrian army, destroying many tanks and so on, that maybe that's the reason why the Russians intervened. U.S. policy in Syria is almost totally incoherent. It claims to be opposed to ISIS. It's also opposed to all the forces that are opposing ISIS. It's opposed to the Assad government. It's opposed to the jihadi groups, but it's supporting them. The al-Nusra Front, the al-Shams, they're hardly distinguishable from ISIS. It's mostly a turf battle. Al-Nusra Front, which is the main one, is supported by Turkey, U.S. ally, supported by Qatar and Saudi Arabia, U.S. allies. The U.S. is opposed to them. The Kurds are the main ground force fighting ISIS. Their main element, PKK, is on the U.S. terrorist list. I mean, you just can't put all of this together into any kind of coherent policy. I don't think there is one, and there's no indication of any long-term policy, just trying to patch things up here and there wherever you can. It's a fading imperialism, and that's the way fading imperialisms behave, British as well. I'm afraid over time, I believe.
Professor Chomsky, thank you very much. For many of us here, this is, I think, the first opportunity that we've had to talk to someone and listen to someone who's written so many books, and your stature and an opinion that everyone respects in the world. We would like to thank you. We are honored, and we hope that sometime again we'll be able to connect with you and learn more from you. So thank you very much, and have a very nice day.
Thank you very much.